Have you ever felt like you're too much in relationships while the other person seems like they're never enough? Like you're constantly doing the emotional heavy lifting, understanding, soothing, checking in, while they keep their distance, pull away, or disappear just when things get real. Let's talk about why that happens. When you grow up experiencing emotional neglect, not abuse, not cruelty, but a quiet absence of emotional validation, you learn one thing very early on, Zay. To survive, I have to tune into everyone else because no one's tuning into me. And so begins the making of the super empath, someone who's hyper attuned to feelings, needs, moods, and the energy in the room. You become an emotional mind reader. You anticipate pain before it arrives. You offer understanding before it's even asked for. But here's the trap. Because you weren't emotionally held, you now try to earn love through performance, through being the safe one, the understanding one, the healer, and who finds the irresistible, the avoidant. Avoidance, people who learned intimacy is threatening, are drawn to empaths like moths to a flame. You feel warm, giving, non-threatening. But the moment they start to get close, their old wiring kicks in. They distance, they confuse, they leave. And the super empath, you take it personally, you try harder. You feel like maybe if you're even more understanding, more patient, they'll finally choose you. Here's the hard truth. You were trained to love unavailable people because emotional unavailability feels familiar. But here's the breakthrough. Familiar doesn't mean safe. Familiar doesn't mean love. It's time to unlearn the story that says your value comes from reading people's emotions better than they read their own. You are not here to be someone's emotional rehab center. You are not here to fix people who treat vulnerability like a disease. You deserve someone who meets you, not just someone who's amazed by your light, but someone who brings their own. When someone experiences emotional neglect growing up, it doesn't always look like trauma in the traditional sense. There may not have been shouting, abuse, or chaos. In fact, on the outside, it might have looked like everything was fine, but emotional neglect is subtle. It's the absence of attunement, the kind of attention that says, I see you, I feel you, and I care about your inner world. When this emotional mirroring is missing, children are left to process their feelings alone. And over time, they stop expressing their needs entirely, not because they don't have them, but because they learned no one's really listening. This kind of neglect doesn't harden a person in the way overt trauma often does. Instead, it softens them in a way that can be dangerous. They become watchers, feelers, people who walk into a room and instantly read the emotional climate. Not because they're naturally gifted, but because they had to be. It was survival. When no one asks how you're feeling, you start to look outward. You become the child who knows when dad is in a bad mood and disappears quietly. You know when mom's on the edge of tears and shift your tone to make things easier. You shape yourself around other people's emotional states because it gives you a sense of safety, or at least predictability. This hyper attunement grows with you. You might become the person who remembers everyone's birthday, senses unspoken tension in a room, and offers comfort before it's requested. You know how to support, soothe, and show up. But the cost is that you often lose sight of yourself. You become more fluent in other people's emotions than your own. You might not even realize it's happening. After all, people like this are praised. They're the mature children, the peacemakers, the empaths. But underneath that praise is a quiet wound. I only feel valuable when I'm useful to someone else. The super empath isn't born, they're built, crafted through years of emotional self-abandonment. They learn that in order to be safe, to be loved, they need to be the person who gets it, the person who is never too much, who doesn't have inconvenient needs, who doesn't ask to be held. They become caretakers instead of being cared for. And eventually it becomes a part of their identity, this ability to feel deeply, to intuit pain, to anticipate someone else's emotional storm before it arrives. It's not just a skill, It's a reflex. It's their way of existing in the world. But the origin of this empathy wasn't pure connection. It was protection. Emotional neglect teaches children that their feelings aren't valid or welcome, and so they go silent. But the nervous system still craves connection, still craves some kind of emotional contact. So it adapts. It says, if I can't be seen, maybe I can at least see. If I can't be heard, maybe I can become a great listener. If no one's coming to care for me, maybe I'll learn to care for everyone else. This dynamic doesn't just show up in childhood. It bleeds into adult relationships. These super empaths are often the ones who fall into patterns with emotionally unavailable partners. They feel drawn to people who are hard to reach, hard to read, or emotionally inconsistent. And they think it's chemistry, but really it's familiarity. It mirrors the original wound. Being with someone who doesn't quite see you, doesn't quite show up, that's not new. That's what they were trained to endure. Emotional neglect doesn't always leave scars you can see, but it creates a blueprint for how someone believes love works. And when that blueprint says your feelings are too much, your needs are invisible, and your role is to serve, you build an identity around giving, around caretaking, around over-functioning. That's the root of the super empath, not just someone who feels deeply, but someone who was never allowed to feel at all unless it served someone else. When you've spent your early years learning that love is conditional, that your emotions, needs, or expressions were met with silence, indifference, or dismissal, you start to internalize the idea that you have to earn love, and not just by being good, but by being useful, soothing, low maintenance, or even invisible. As you grow up, this emotional conditioning doesn't just go away. It follows you into adulthood, into friendships, relationships, even your work life. You become someone who constantly feels the need to prove your worth, not by being who you are, but by what you do for others emotionally. Super empaths don't just care deeply, they care compulsively. They become addicted to giving. They offer understanding in situations where most people would walk away. They excuse bad behavior with the phrase, but I understand why they act that way. They read between the lines, fill in emotional gaps, and justify people's absence with compassion. Not because those people have earned it, but because the empath has learned that being emotionally available makes them deserving of love, even if it never comes in return. At the root of all this is a belief that love is a performance, that if you can just stay calm enough, kind enough, patient enough, you'll finally be chosen. You'll finally be valued. And so super empaths often find themselves in one-sided emotional dynamics, constantly giving, rarely receiving. They offer support before it's asked, forgive before an apology is given, and remain loyal long after their own emotional needs have been ignored. They don't just give people the benefit of the doubt, they rewrite the entire narrative to make someone else's emotional shortcomings seem noble, misunderstood, or wounded. But what's rarely acknowledged is the pain beneath that generosity. Behind the kindness is someone who's afraid that if they stop being useful, they'll be abandoned. That if they start asking for what they need, they'll be seen as needy, demanding, or too much. So they withhold, they smile through disappointment. They shrink their own needs in order to maintain peace. Their empathy becomes a tool for survival, not connection. This pattern is exhausting, but it's also strangely validating because in constantly trying to understand and fix others, the super empath feels in control. There's a kind of safety in always being the giver. You never have to risk being vulnerable. You never have to face rejection because you're not really showing your true self in the first place. You're offering a curated version, the one who's always okay, always capable, always fine. But being the one who never needs anything eventually becomes a cage. You may appear strong, but inside there's often a deep loneliness, a sense of invisibility, because no one really knows you, only the role you play. Even in romantic relationships, this plays out in painful ways. Super empaths are often attracted to emotionally unavailable partners because it gives them the opportunity to prove their worth, to fix, to rescue. They believe that if they can just love someone hard enough, that person will finally open up, finally see them, finally stay. And when it doesn't happen, they blame themselves. They double down. They become more understanding, more patient, more giving, hoping that this time it will be enough. This pattern isn't selfless. It's survival. It's a learned response to not being emotionally tended to. And while society celebrates people who are so good at caring for others, what's often missed is the cost. Super empaths often neglect themselves. They bury their own pain under the weight of other people's problems. They become so attuned to others that they forget how to attune to themselves. And it's not because they don't want to be seen. It's because being seen with all their messy, raw, emotional truth still feels dangerous. When your entire identity is built around emotional usefulness, letting go of that role can feel terrifying. But the truth is, you were never meant to earn love through emotional labor. Love that has to be constantly proven isn't love. It's a transaction. And super empaths, for all their strength, often forget that their worth doesn't come from how much they give. It comes from who they are when they stop performing. There's a magnetism between the super empath and the avoidant that can feel electric at first glance. It's not random. It's not bad luck. It's a patterned attraction rooted in childhood conditioning, unmet needs, and the subconscious drive to find emotional resolution in familiar dynamics. The super empath, who has learned to survive by tuning into other people's emotions, is drawn to emotionally distant or guarded individuals, not despite their aloofness, but because of it. There's something about the emotional puzzle that feels both familiar and worth solving. Avoidant individuals, often shaped by early experiences that taught them vulnerability is dangerous or burdensome, learn to self-protect by creating distance. They become uncomfortable with emotional closeness, intimacy, and reliance. They may appear strong and independent, but under the surface lies a deep fear of being engulfed, controlled, or emotionally smothered. As adults, this shows up as an instinct to retreat, to pull away when things get too close, to keep others at arm's length. Even when they crave connection, the super empath finds this emotional unavailability almost irresistible, not because they enjoy being hurt or rejected, but because they're wired to feel at home in emotional imbalance. They've been trained to work for connection, to prove their value, to earn love through understanding and patience. So when they encounter an avoidant, they don't see the red flags. They see a challenge. They see someone who's just scared, just needs time, or has been hurt before. They pour themselves into proving they're safe, loving, and dependable, hoping their presence will coax the avoidant into opening up. On the surface, it may look like the avoidant holds the power by withholding affection, vulnerability, or commitment. But beneath that dynamic is a delicate dance of mutual reenactment. The avoidant finds the empath appealing because they don't demand too much. The empath leads with softness, patience, and emotional intelligence, all things that feel safe to someone afraid of being emotionally trapped. The avoidant feels seen without having to reveal too much. They can stay closed while still receiving care. It's the perfect setup for a while. But eventually, the cracks show. The super empath begins to feel emotionally starved. They give and give and give and get breadcrumbs in return. They rationalize, make excuses, and try harder. But the intimacy they crave never fully arrives. Meanwhile, the avoidant starts to feel the pressure of being expected to reciprocate. The more the empath leans in, the more the avoidant leans out. The emotional intimacy that once felt warm and healing begins to feel threatening to the avoidant's nervous system. And so they withdraw. This dynamic is painful and confusing. The super empath starts to question their worth. Am I too intense? Am I asking for too much? They may even blame themselves for the avoidance retreat. But what's really happening is that both people are playing out old survival roles. The empath is chasing the kind of connection they never got, believing that if they can finally unlock someone emotionally closed off, it will prove their value. The avoidant is reliving the script that says closeness is unsafe and any emotional demand is a risk to their independence. The tragic irony is that both people want love. The super empath wants to feel emotionally close and seen. The avoidant wants to feel safe and accepted. But because of the way they're wired, they end up reinforcing each other's wounds. The more the empath pursues, the more the avoidant retreats. The more the avoidant retreats, the more the empath tries to fix it. It becomes a cycle of emotional chasing and running that leaves both people feeling unseen and misunderstood. This attraction doesn't mean either person is bad or broken. It means there's unresolved emotional history that's driving their behavior. The super empath is not being too much, and the avoidant is not simply cold. They are both protecting themselves the only way they've known how. But without awareness, this pairing becomes toxic, not because they don't care, but because their styles of connection speak different emotional languages. The super empath speaks through closeness, the avoidant speaks through distance. Both are trying to feel safe. But in trying to get what they need, they end up triggering each other's deepest fears. When a super empath ends up in a relationship with an avoidant partner, they unknowingly step into a dynamic that feels hauntingly familiar. It's not just about two different communication styles, it's a reenactment of their earliest emotional blueprint. The empath, who was emotionally trained to anticipate others' needs and silence their own, naturally slips into the role of the emotional caregiver. The avoidant, who was conditioned to associate intimacy with vulnerability and discomfort, leans into their instinct to detach, suppress, or distance when things get too close. Together, they form a loop that feels like love at first, but turns into a cycle of deep emotional frustration. This loop begins innocently enough. The super empath shows up as understanding, deeply present, emotionally generous. They offer safety and comfort to the avoidant, who at first finds it refreshing. There's no pressure, no emotional outbursts, just steady, calm, nurturing presence. The avoidant may feel seen for the first time without feeling trapped. But as the connection grows, so do the expectations for intimacy. And that's when the dynamic begins to shift. For the super empath, closeness is nourishment. Emotional intimacy is how they feel bonded, safe, and connected. They're not just looking for affection, they're looking for mutual emotional presence. So when the avoidant starts to withdraw, to pull back emotionally or become inconsistent, the empath immediately senses the shift. They become hyper-aware. They question what went wrong, and instead of expressing frustration or need, they self-correct. They try to be even more understanding, more patient, more easy to love. In essence, they begin to over-function emotionally. This over-functioning means they take on the responsibility for the emotional tone of the relationship. They initiate the conversations. They soothe the tension. They make excuses for the other person's emotional distance. They feel compelled to hold the relationship together with sheer emotional effort. On the other side, the avoidant underfunctions in the emotional space. They detach when conflict arises, shut down instead of opening up, and prioritize self-protection over connection. The more they are given emotional space, the more they retreat into it. And the more they retreat, the more the super empath leans in, trying to fill the vacuum with love, logic, or loyalty. This imbalance is rarely acknowledged directly. The avoidant doesn't usually say, "I'm scared of intimacy," and the empath doesn't say, "I'm terrified you'll abandon me if I stop giving." But that's exactly what's happening underneath the surface. Both are locked in unconscious fear. The empath fears being invisible. The avoidant fears being overwhelmed, so they continue to dance, one chasing connection, the other avoiding it. Over time, this loop becomes emotionally exhausting. The empath starts to feel depleted. They begin to sense that no matter how much they give, it's never enough to truly reach their partner. They may even start to lose connection with themselves. Their own needs, feelings, and desires get buried beneath the effort to be the steady one, the understanding one. Meanwhile, the avoidant may start to feel smothered, not because the empath is actually overwhelming, but because any sustained emotional presence feels threatening to their nervous system. Their instinct is to escape, to create emotional distance, to regulate themselves by withdrawing. The problem isn't that either person is flawed or unlovable. It's that the balance of emotional labor is unsustainable. When one person does all the emotional heavy lifting, resentment builds silently. And that resentment is often misinterpreted by the avoidant as pressure or neediness, when in reality, it's the empath reaching their limit. They're tired of being the emotional anchor with no safe harbor of their own. They're tired of feeling like love is a job interview they have to keep showing up for over and over again. This loop can continue for months or even years because it mimics what both people learned in childhood. The empath may have been taught that love comes through proving your emotional value. The avoidant may have learned that emotions are dangerous and must be minimized. Together, they reenact that unresolved pain, and until both become aware of the roles they're playing, the pattern won't stop. The empath will keep giving more than they receive, and the avoidant will keep running from the very connection they quietly crave. There's a moment in every super empath's journey when they start to feel the weight of all the emotional labor they've been carrying. Not just in their current relationships, but throughout their entire lives. It's a quiet realization that the love they've been working so hard to earn hasn't been truly fulfilling. It's been conditional, inconsistent, and often painful. And when they start to look at that pattern honestly, something clicks. The relationships they've been drawn to, the ones that felt most magnetic or intense, weren't based on safety or true connection. They were based on familiarity. That familiarity often stems from early emotional environments where love was unpredictable, where emotional needs weren't consistently met, or where expressing vulnerability led to disappointment. So the nervous system adapted. It got used to being in spaces where love had to be earned, where people were distant, and where your emotional needs were either minimized or ignored. Over time, that inconsistency became the emotional baseline. It started to feel like home. So when the super empath meets someone who's emotionally unavailable, inconsistent, or distant, they don't necessarily see it as unhealthy. They see it as an opportunity. They think, if I can just be good enough, if I can love them the right way, maybe this time I'll get the connection I've always longed for. But what they're really doing is trying to heal an old wound by recreating it. They confuse the intensity of chasing love with the feeling of being in love. And because the pursuit is so emotionally charged, it feels real, even though it's based on lack, not mutuality. The truth is, familiarity isn't the same as love. Just because something feels emotionally recognizable doesn't mean it's healthy. Pain can feel comfortable when it's what you've known. Distance can feel safe when you've never experienced someone leaning all the way in. And emotional inconsistency can feel romantic when your earliest experiences taught you that love is something that comes in waves instead of steady, secure presence. This realization can be deeply unsettling for a super empath. It forces them to look at how their emotional patterns have been driven by survival, not by desire. It reveals how often they've mistaken hard work for compatibility and emotional intensity for intimacy. And it shows them that love doesn't have to be a struggle to be meaningful. In fact, the healthiest kind of love often feels calm, boring even to someone used to chaos. But calm is not emptiness. Calm is peace. Calm is safety. Learning to choose what's actually safe over what's emotionally familiar is one of the hardest but most important shifts a super empath can make. It requires them to tune back into themselves after years of being hyper attuned to others. It means asking, does this person meet me where I am emotionally? Do I feel seen, heard, and valued without having to prove myself? And perhaps most importantly, can I let go of the belief that love is something I have to earn through endless understanding, patience, or sacrifice? This shift doesn't mean becoming cold or less empathetic. It means reclaiming your emotional energy. It means realizing that your empathy is a gift, but not everyone is worthy of receiving it. It means choosing relationships where emotional labor is mutual, where vulnerability is welcomed, and where your presence is enough. not something that needs to be constantly justified. The path to that kind of connection starts with recognizing the emotional pattern that keeps you stuck. It starts with letting go of the hope that the emotionally unavailable person will finally change. It starts with understanding that you don't have to relive the past to heal it. You can choose something new, something healthy, something that doesn't drain you just to keep it alive. Love doesn't require you to abandon yourself. In fact, real love starts when you stop doing that, when you begin to choose not what feels familiar, but what feels safe, not what ignites your anxiety, but what brings peace. And in that space, where you no longer confuse emotional labor with love, you finally begin to experience the